All right, so thank you so much for coming today. I'm Ethan Corson. I'm the Dole Institute's Spring Fellow, and I am really excited. So today is our third of 7 discussion group sessions on our topic of international trade in the 21st century. And today we're going to talk about trade with my friend Jordan Haas, who is the Director of Trade Policy at the Internet Association. So to briefly recap where we are in the discussion group, so we had our first session with Scott Handler. And Scott talked about the decades-long period after World War II where we generally had a bipartisan consensus that was supportive of free trade. So we talked about some of the landmark achievements in that period, things like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We talked about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and we talked about the formation of the World Trade Organization. In last week's conversation, we talked with Arun Venkataraman, and he talked about the breakdown of that consensus and how in recent years, both major political parties have become increasingly hostile to free trade. And so my takeaway from that conversation was that it's not that Americans are anti-trade per se, but it's that anti-trade sentiment is essentially a proxy for deeper anxieties that people feel about the economy. So my goal today with Jordan is to have him really put us in the room and talk to us about what it's like to be negotiating with members of Congress and to share with us his experience working with Congress on getting trade promotion authority through Congress, negotiations around congressional ratification of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and what is currently going on with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. But before we get into our conversation, I want to talk about our couple remaining sessions. So we've got 4 more sessions after today. So next week on March 6th, we'll take a deep dive into the Trump administration's trade policies with Atman Trivedi, former senior director for global policy in global markets at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And we'll look at the Trump administration's philosophy, policy decisions, and results when it comes to international trade. After taking a brief pause for spring break, on March 20th, we're going to talk about how trade affects us right here in Kansas with Mike Matson, Director of Industry Affairs and Development at the Kansas Farm Bureau. And I'm really excited about our March 27th session where we'll talk to Megan Grube, the former Director of Speechwriting at the U.S. Department of Commerce, about her experience crafting the Obama administration's public messaging on trade and how pro and anti-trade narratives have helped shape public opinion. On April 3rd, we're going to conclude our discussion group by looking at how trade agreements are enforced with Paul Pequato, former Assistant Secretary for Enforcement and Compliance in the International Trade Administration. So I want to introduce Jordan, and then we'll get right to our conversation. Jordan and I will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll leave plenty of time for your questions. So I had the good fortune of working with Jordan at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where Jordan served in the International Trade Administration. He was the Director of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs. In that position, Jordan played a leading role in advancing the Obama administration's trade legislative agenda, including running the department's Trans-Pacific Partnership outreach and serving as an active member of the White House Interagency Trade Team. Prior to joining the Department of Commerce, Jordan served as Deputy Assistant Administrator for Congressional and Legislative Affairs at the U.S. Small Business Administration. Jordan has also worked on Capitol Hill, including as a legislative director for a member of Congress and for the Committee on Small Business in the U.S. House of Representatives. Jordan is currently the Director of Trade Policy at the Internet Association, a trade association that represents leading global internet companies on matters of public policy and whose mission is to foster innovation, promote economic growth, and empower people through the free and open internet. One of the reasons that Jordan and I think are good friends is that Jordan is as big of a Cleveland sports fan as I am a Kansas City sports fan, and to be a sports fan of either one of those cities is to sort of know both the highest of highs and some of the lowest of lows. So please join me. More of the lowest of lows. More of the lowest of lows, but please join me in welcoming Jordan Haas to the Dole Institute.
Thank you. Excellent. Happy to be here.
So Jordan, before we talk about your work with Congress and on a whole range, really, of trade and technology issues. I want to talk about your career path. I know we have some students here who I think may be interested in careers in Washington, D.C. at some point. And the thing I always tell people is that the hardest job to get in D.C. is that first job on Capitol Hill. So talk about your experience and how you got yours.
Yeah, so I went to school in D.C., and when you go to school in D.C., one of the key things is internships. And I started interning at a trade association, and they expanded my role while I was interning there, and basically told me after almost 2 years that I'd reached as high as I would get without going to Capitol Hill. You really need the Hill experience to learn about how DC works, how legislative process works, and get a true understanding of how you can actually make change up on Capitol Hill. In a very DC fashion, it worked by a connection passed my resume along. Often that's how it works. You want someone to think about you at the moment when a job opens up, because when jobs open up on Capitol Hill, they'll often get 1,000 resumes. And so being able to have your resume passed along is always key. And one of the key things that I continue to do is always meeting with young students and others who want to work on Capitol Hill with the idea that I got helped early on in the career, and now it's always good to help those later on.
And you did, I want to talk about the distinctions, because you worked both as a committee staffer,
Yeah.
so as a professional staffer on a committee, and also as a legislative director for a member. Yeah. And so talk to us about the differences between committee staff and a member's personal office staff.
Yeah, I actually started on Capitol Hill on the Senate side in a leadership committee. So I actually worked leadership committee, then standing committee, and then personal office. How the Hill works is members serve on specific committees, and that's where legislative jurisdictions take place, where legislation moves, where oversight hearings take place. And so on committee staff, one of the jobs I was responsible for was working with individual members who served on the committee, making sure that their messaging, that they had what they needed, that they understood legislation that was moving. We worked with them on the press they would do. And then I would also manage floor time around when legislation came through. So lining up the speakers, making sure that we had people on both sides being able to talk about the bill in a positive way as we were moving it, or amendment in a positive way, and managing that process. And then I had the good fortune of working for a member as a legislative director. A legislative director, as it sounds, runs the legislative process within a member's office. So that's drafting legislation, that is deciding which amendments, advising the member on how to vote. So before every vote, you would put together a vote card to send them down to the floor so they understood sort of the pros and cons of various issues.
And you've had this interesting career working at this intersection of government, business, technology, and trade. How did you get involved with that particular issue set? And what did you find about those issues that was really intriguing to you?
Yeah, so most of my career, as you mentioned, has been focused on the economics of government, the pushing economic policy within government. I started my career at the Trade Association was in dealing with the electronics industry. And then when I was on the Hill, 5 years of it was on the small business side, so focused on small business policy, and joined the Obama administration in dealing with small business policy, advocating for lending for small businesses, making sure that government contracting, the small businesses have access to that, and ensuring that the government's programs around economic development actually benefit small businesses and that they're able to take advantage of it. I think I've always just been drawn to that. The trade side, I worked, when I was on the Hill, worked on moving individual trade agreements, both on the committee staff side as well as in the personal office, but came to that during the second term of the Obama administration while we were at the Department of Commerce together.
And you mentioned a trade association, and I remember when I moved to DC, I had no idea what a trade association was, what it did. So talk to us about what a trade association is, what it does, and the role that they play in the policymaking process.
Yeah. So I think the easiest way to think about it is it's a convening entity for businesses within a specific industry. So the policy that you end up focused on, so it's part convener, part think tank, and then part advocacy. I think a lot of times you think of just the advocacy side, but the reality is it's the convener and it's the think tank side of it that makes up a big part of what trade associations do. And the interesting part is you're looking at advocating for not one specific business, but you're looking at issues that cross-cut all businesses within that industry. So you're building consensus around specific advocacy for a specific industry. The example, as you mentioned, I work for the Internet Association, which represents internet-based companies. So the issues that we work on impact all the businesses across that sphere of industry. And it's both working for the businesses, but then also the consumers within that. And one of the areas that the association has been forward-leaning on is net neutrality. It's a topic, a buzzword out there. Everyone's well aware of it. We are one of the leading advocacy groups in favor of net neutrality, both when a few years back when it was originally out there, and then now as Congress is reconsidering taking action on it. We are advocating for a policy that benefits consumers, that benefits the businesses, and that cross-cuts all of the industry as a whole.
Mm-hmm. And trade associations occupy this interesting space because on one hand, it makes sense that you want lawmakers and people who are working on legislation to have the best information possible about how a particular piece of legislation is going to impact an industry, how it's going to impact their consumers, how it's going to affect their business model. But there's also criticism that trade associations, like lobbying firms, are sort of part and parcel of what people feel like is this system where big business, where these organizations have an outsized role in policymaking and in shaping public policy, that the voice of the average person gets sort of drowned out amid this, that there's special access, there's special sort of treatment for organizations that are big enough to be a part of a trade association or something like that.
Businesses of all sizes join trade associations.
So how do you think about that dichotomy, though, right? There's you want to provide good information to legislators, but then there's also these sort of criticisms of...
Yeah, I mean, I think the criticisms are there. I think, there's no way to not acknowledge that. But the reality is, as I was talking about, trade associations don't just represent one individual business, don't just represent one individual company, but really look at the industry as a whole, all of the jobs associated with that specific industry, all of the benefits for specific policies along, and work with both members of Congress and the administration in understanding the policy that they're drafting, how it actually could impact, and what the real world impacts of what they're coming up with. That goes into the education side of it. And when we served together at the Department of Commerce, there were specific departments dedicated to specific industries, where you have the services department, the chemicals department, and those are dedicated, much like a trade association, to a specific industry and a specific set of ideas. And they want to benefit that industry and make sure that they have an understanding of what actually goes on, how the industry works. I would say when you have meetings with both the administration, when I have meetings with both the administration and Capitol Hill, a lot of it is they want to know, what does it mean for my district or my area? How does it matter for the jobs in my area? And what does this actually mean for the consumers and workers within that area? And so that's a lot of what trade associations are able to do, is the education side on that.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to jump into sort of the three big legislative areas that that you were a part of the congressional work around. And the first is Trade Promotion Authority. And you'll remember that this is something that we talked about a little bit in our first discussion group with Scott Handler, but so sort of set the stage for us and about, first, what is Trade Promotion Authority, And why did the Obama administration feel like it was an important thing that they needed in order to conclude the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Yeah. So Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA, it used to be called Fast Track. And what it basically sets out is the Constitution allows for Congress to negotiate trade. And what Fast Track does is it sets the rules for what a trade agreement should cover and the rules around how the trade agreement should look. And then by doing that, provides that to the administration, to the president, who then can negotiate on behalf of the United States government. In return for setting that and having one person negotiate, they receive an up or down vote from Congress on final passage and final implementation of a trade agreement. So the basic way to think about it is Congress sets the rules for what should be in the trade agreement. The president then gets to negotiate, so you have one person negotiating rather than 535 different negotiators, which you would never get anything done at that point.
Right.
And then then it goes back to Congress, and Congress will decide either yes or no on the trade agreement. So you mentioned TPP, and when we worked on TPA, the previous Fast Track Authority had expired, so it needed to be moved again or re-upped for the trade agreement to get an up or down vote, plus to hear from Congress on what the priorities would be and should be within the negotiations before the final negotiations were done. Within a trade agreement and trade policy, if Congress had the ability to amend the trade agreement during the legislative process, no country would give their best deal at that point. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't end up getting actual policy done, and trade negotiations would come to a standstill. So I think the idea of getting TPA done before we moved and before TPP closed was a priority to be able to try and find a path forward to accomplish TPP. As we'll talk about, we didn't bring TPP across the finish line, but that same TPA authority was used for the NAFTA negotiations. The USMCA negotiations will be used for the 3 new set of negotiations that have just been kicked off with Japan, with the EU, and with the UK. So the rules that were set out in TPA that we moved in 2015 are still governing right now, all the negotiations going on.
And so just getting TPA through Congress took a lot of different twists and turns. So walk us through what it was like to be somebody who was there and negotiating with Congress, and sort of set the stage and talk to us about what that looked like to get that across the finish line.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've talked in your previous sessions about this, but trade doesn't tend to break down across normal partisan lines. All trade votes, or modern trade votes, tend to be about 2/3 Republicans, 1/3 Democrats. It tends to be more geographically based than focused on strictly the head of the party saying, hey, we're going to vote for this or against this. The upside is this is the way that the framers of the Constitution ended up thinking that Congress should work, is that each piece of legislation is viewed on its merit, and that negotiations and compromise have to take place for it to be accomplished. The downside is they tend to be very labor intensive, not the prettiest processes, and can often be frustrating and sometimes go down. The last few trade votes have passed by only 1 or 2 votes. So they come down to the very wire, and it doesn't break down across partisan lines. So it's coming down to that level in not the prettiest way often. And I think TPA was a prime example of it not being the prettiest process, but in the end we got a good product out of it. And part of that was, maybe I should just walk through a little bit about...
Yeah, take us through the timeline.
A little bit of the timeline, and in preparing and going back to look at some notes from that time period, it was a little bit of a walk down memory lane, but it was a full-fledged, full administration process. As we mentioned, TPP negotiations were well underway at that point. They had not found the final landing zones for key issues. And so some of it was hearing from Congress what were the important issues. The process started with, the TPA process started with the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee charged with trade within the House of Representatives, the Democrat and Republican, negotiating with the Senate Finance Committee chair and ranking member. Before a final deal was set, the ranking member at the time, Congressman Levin, decided that he wasn't happy with the way that the process was going. So
this is Sander Levin, congressman from Michigan, right?
Correct.
A state that's obviously had, and probably his district that's had
some impact on trade, and has
been impacted by trade.
And Michigan tends to be a very big union state, and unions traditionally have had more concern with trade policy, and are often the ones on the other side talking about the issues and the pitfalls of trade. Ranking Member Levin had been a key part of the negotiations, ended up pulling away at the very end as Congressman Wyden, or Senator Wyden, Senator Hatch, and Paul Ryan were negotiating on the final TPA. They came out with an agreement in April of 2015, at which point both sides started clicking in to high gear on educating about both what was in the agreement as well as explaining the negatives or the positives of the agreement. You had members on the opposition side, led by Congresswoman DeLauro, who were talking about the problems with the TPA package and what was included in it, raising some concerns around labor and environment tends to be two of the key issues that the opposition tends to focus on.
And that's interesting. So what are some of the concerns when you're talking with members? What are those conversations like? I mean, what are the concerns? How are they verbalizing them to you? I mean, is it my district? Is it a philosophical thing? Is it this how it's impacting my district? Is it this is how I'm worried about this specific industry? Or
yeah, so I think it's a member by member. As we talked about, it doesn't break down traditional partisan lines. It tends to go by what their district looks like, what the workforce looks like. And with TPA, it was also interesting because we weren't defending a specific trade agreement at that point. We were defending trade policy in general and educating about what trade looked like for that district. So I'll give an example. We worked very closely with a member from Texas, and we looked at what trade looked like for his district, what were the top industries. And for that district, home health care products were one that you didn't think would be a major one for that district, but ended up being a huge job creator in that district based on trade with Mexico and what was going back and forth across the border. And so explaining that to that member, bringing in the experts from commerce that talked about the various the data and the jobs within that district, he ended up deciding to support the legislation and TPA. But it really is a case-by-case basis, and it is, when we were doing TPA, it was explaining trade in general, explaining what it looked like for the district, answering a lot of misconceptions that had been there. We were at that point about 20 years on from NAFTA. We're at 25 years now. And so it had been baked into the economy. So we knew a lot of what it actually looked like for specific districts, what the North American market looked like. And we were describing that. And then we were also describing what trade with Europe at the same time that we were negotiating TPP. We were also negotiating TTIP. Those negotiations no longer exist.
TTIP was the Transatlantic Investment Partnership, right?
It was between
the U.S. and EU.
And the EU, exactly. So the Trump administration has actually restarted talks on EU-U.S. agreement, started from scratch on that, though.
And one of the interesting dynamics that I want to talk about is so this was something that the Obama administration was putting a lot of its weight behind.
Yeah.
They viewed it as a big priority for
set up a war room inside the West Wing, coordinating for all federal agencies.
And so when you think about this,
yeah.
I mean, I always tell people it's sort of like, it's a funnel. I mean, there are only so many things that you can devote political capital to at any given moment, right? Only so much can get passed through that funnel. So for the administration to make this such a high priority, and then to have it opposed by Minority Leader at the time, Nancy Pelosi, by Senate Minority Leader at the time, Harry Reid, and so many of the other Democrats, what was that dynamic like to have so many Democrats in Congress who would not support this key legislative priority of a president of their own party?
Yeah. So a few things with that. Speaker Pelosi at the time, Leader Pelosi, waited till the end to decide which way and articulate which way she was voting on TPA. So she made it very clear that she was allowing specific members, to vote how their district made sense for them. So they weren't whipping on behalf of the legislation either for or against. But it definitely, and so that was actually very useful for the administration to be able to go in and not be that person, not be getting pressure from the leader of the party in the House.
Senator Reid was a little bit more outspoken about
Senator Reid was
opposition.
a little more forceful in his view at the time. But the Senate, we had more of a cushion on the votes in the Senate. The House, we were about 2 weeks out from the vote. I think we were about 10 to 12 votes down from where we needed to be, and so it was a very different environment in the House. So having that extra time and the extra support from Leader Pelosi, from Speaker Pelosi, was helpful in allowing members to vote the way that made sense for their districts. And she was very good at bringing in the administration to be able to talk in either caucus meetings or to individual offices. Her staff was excellent in the fact that they would funnel specific requests to the administration, saying this person needs more information, saying this is what's important, we need to hear more about X, Y, or Z, and really set the stage. And I think she's doing a similar thing now. That's sort of her philosophy with trade. And I think it goes back to it's not a partisan issue in the traditional sense.
And so to the extent we're trying to pull together sort of different themes of what we've heard across discussion group sessions, we talked in our very first session about NAFTA and how NAFTA was more or less negotiated by the George H.W. Bush administration, signed into law by President Clinton, but it passed both the House and Senate. It was ratified in both the House and Senate with much more Republican support than it was Democrat support. And similar now, talking about TPA. So TPA passes the Senate 60 to 38, but only 13 Democrats support it, 47 Republicans support it. Again, a key legislative priority of a Democratic administration. It passes the House 218 to 208 with only 28 Democrats and 190 Republicans supporting. So you have 150 House Democrats and voting against trade promotion authority that was sought by a president of their party. So to the extent we're looking at sort of themes across discussion groups, I think that's an interesting one that we should all kind of be thinking about how, to Jordan's point, that this really doesn't always break along party lines. I mean, it's fairly remarkable to have 158 House Democrats vote against something that the president of their party is very high on, is placing a lot of political capital in. So you're able to get through Trade Promotion Authority, and then that takes us right into TPP. And so then you're part of the senior team making this big push to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership through Congress. So talk to us just like, because I don't know that we all remember, but think about the political moment that we were when you were dealing with this and trying to get us through Congress. So just remind us again the political backdrop against which this work is taking place.
Yeah, so by the time they closed, Ambassador Froman, who was USTR at the time, closed TPP, we were already heading into a presidential election year, and we were heading into the very end of an 8-year president's term. And that tends to be a time when they start, members on the Hill and elsewhere, and the press start looking at who's coming next. But work still needs to get done, and this is a top priority for a number of reasons. TPP, we were looking at it for both a strategic point in the isolation of China, so it became a top issue for our military and for geopolitical. We were looking at it as a way to expand and grow new economies and bring Vietnam into a more modern economy. We were looking at it, and here's something that'll come back up, we were looking at it as a way to modernize NAFTA. President Obama ran on the idea of needing to modernize NAFTA, which is a similar message that we heard from President Trump and are hearing now from President Trump with the negotiation of USMCA, NAFTA 2.0. And so all of that was going on. So we are at the end of a presidential term. We are in the middle of a presidential campaign. And through that process, by the time it closed about the fall. We're then into almost the last year of the term. And we have...
The fall of 2015 is when it closed, right?
Yeah. And then, so we're heading into 16 we were looking at. And so once it closes, TPA sets out clear timelines for how a trade agreement can be brought up. As I mentioned, in exchange for an up or down vote, it sets out what the priorities of the trade agreement are, but it also sets out a very clear timeline. And that clear timeline means that certain things need to happen, including having the legislation sit out there for periods of time so people can actually review it. As this is not a strictly partisan vote, it comes down to members having to decide themselves. They need time to review, and a trade agreement can often be pretty thick. And so allowing them time to do it, allowing the ITC time to review the economic impact, allowing any laws that need to be changed within the United States, time to go up. All of that takes time, and there's a clear timeline that's laid out by TPA. So we're then looking at that timeline, and because it's a presidential year, that was around the time that Trump was out there complaining about how TPP was problematic. You had Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, who were in a fight at that time and were both battling. Bernie Sanders had traditionally been a very vocal opponent of trade. And so, you had both of them out there talking about it. I think so it was a challenging environment out there.
So when you're talking to people, so Trump's out there, Trump says the TPP would be a death blow for American manufacturing, and Bernie says TPP is a disastrous trade agreement. Secretary Clinton, who praised the TPP in 2012, called it the gold standard of trade agreements. In 2016, she says that it no longer met her standards for evaluating trade agreements. So when you're up on the Hill, how much are you hearing from members about whether how much are you hearing from them about Trump, Bernie, Hillary, getting people animated against trade in their districts?
So I think it was less, we were hearing less on the Hill about any of those specific members at that time. I think it was more, it was a tough environment to be able to move anything at that point, at an end of an administration. And we were hearing challenges from various other people that I think was more problematic at that moment, where I mentioned Senator Hatch, who was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. He had some concerns that we were working through on biologics and pharma issues. And so there was a lot of educating and explaining what was going on. But I think the vote, I think it was less what the external people were saying and more that it was an end of administration at that point.
So you don't think, so your take would be it wasn't as much of the rhetoric around it from Trump or Hillary. You don't think that really was ultimately what stopped it from being passed? You think it was more just the internal dynamics?
I think internal dynamics and the internal at the end of an administration that were at play.
So one of the things that people have said is, and I'm curious where you land on this, is that one of the mistakes that the Obama administration made was waiting until too close to the end of the administration to make their big push on TPP. And that had they moved earlier and put their full weight of the administration and put some real political capital behind it earlier, before we were in this time where we were already in the heat of a presidential campaign, that maybe it would have been different. What do you think of that? What do you make of that?
So I think that, again, looking back on it, you can always say, because we didn't get it across the finish line, so obviously what we did was not the best outcome.
Well,
that said, a decision was made that we were going for a lame duck vote, and there was serious talk of the consideration that it would free up members to be able to vote at that point. It wouldn't be an issue then. That they would have to take stands on during a primary, or during a primary fight, or during a general election fight. And so all of that, that was a calculation that was made. As for closing the agreement sooner, the agreement, when you're negotiating with that many different parties, it takes time.
Right.
And, I can say that before the agreement closed, we were prepared for it to close a number of times. Negotiating sessions before it actually ended up closing. Mm-hmm. So we were prepared for it to happen a little sooner, but the reality is negotiations take time,
right?
And to get the best deal possible often takes time, and that's where we were with that.
Was there a particular moment or meeting or time where it sort of hit you like a bolt of lightning that this just isn't going to happen? Was there a time you came to that realization? Do you remember that?
Yeah, Election Day. I think the reality is, I think there was an understanding or a view that we'd be able to have a path forward, and I think we were all planning for what a Clinton administration would look like. The reality is Trump. Everything upended at that point, and I think a lot of the oxygen left the room. Mm-hmm. And so getting anything done during a lame duck at that point just did not happen and was not going to happen. And so especially a win for the president's party was just not going to be there at that moment. So I think the day after the election, I think, the final thing was 3 days after he was sworn into office, when Trump fully pulled out of.
Yeah.
I think, when you looked at and heard Secretary Clinton's rhetoric, it was more focused on having to renegotiate, having to tweak the agreement, where Trump was, his view was a complete withdrawal from the agreement, and there's nothing that can be fixed about it.
You've talked about this, but when you're talking, just to isolate this particular thing, when you're talking to members of Congress, are they, is the feedback that you get from them, is it really just focused on how trade affects their district, or is it, I have a philosophical or academic view for or against trade, or what are the things that they're really talking to you about? I mean, how are they verbalizing this when you're in there negotiating and talking to them?
Yeah, so I think it's different for every member of Congress. Every member of Congress comes to all of their issues sort of uniquely. I would say that the majority of them are more focused on what their district looks like when it comes to trade and how it's impacted by trade. But that doesn't mean that that's for everyone. There are some that are either very pro or very against because of their previous life and their previous career. But it really is a case-by-case basis. And I think this goes back to what I was talking about before, where it's not because you're a Democrat, you support this issue, or because you're a Republican, you support this issue, and not just this issue, but coming at it this way. Trade breaks down differently. And so everyone comes to it differently, and everyone comes to it in sort of their unique way, and what they need to be able to either cast a vote for, or the reason why they cast a vote against any specific agreement is more rooted in the agreement itself. And I think you see that through the process, and the guidance that Leader Pelosi and others give is hold your fire. Don't come out on the trade agreement either for or against too early, making sure that you understand what the content is. And now that we have TPA, it sets out clear rules for that content and how the process goes. So making sure you're as well informed as possible before you have to cast that ballot.
And before we move on from the whole TPP experience, are there any lessons that you took away from your experience working on TPP that you would pass along to a future administration who's trying to negotiate a significant trade agreement, trying to get that through Congress? Are there sort of lessons learned from being a part of the senior team of that process?
Yeah, so I think education's key. Education often, education early. And I think the other thing that, the Obama administration, I think, did very well was organizing all of the cabinet secretaries. So it wasn't just rooted in one cabinet secretary. It wasn't just USTR pushing it, but it was the whole administration. So you had the Secretary of Ag out there, you had Treasury, you had Defense, you had Commerce, Transportation, all talking about how the agreement impacts that part of the economy that they're specialized in, and being able to talk on specific segments. I think the other thing that we did incredibly well was anytime a member had a question or wanted more information, we would have a secretary, depending on what their question was, ready to call them back within half a day. So that was something that we viewed very highly, and I think is important to members feeling heard, and members, and not losing a vote from a member because you never returned the phone call. And I think that is incredibly important. And I think administrations as a whole can always do more of that and more education. But that is some of what I took away from it.
I do remember vividly Secretary Pritzker had a list from the White House of the members that she was to take the lead on talking with and being responsive to, and talking them through concerns and answering questions. And
so that those members would also know where to turn to. Also, a lot of it when you're on the Hill and when you're a member of Congress, even figuring out who the right person to call is can take time for a staffer and can take time for a member. And so, she was very forward-leaning on that, providing her cell phone, being very active in that. She understood the true benefit of being that person on the other line and making sure that they had the information they needed, which I think fell to us then to be able to make sure we knew the information and knew what the questions would be. So she was ready to be able to answer them.
Everybody who's come in looks so much more well-rested than they did during the administration. We've had Scott, Arun, and now you, and everybody looks so much better that they're getting some sleep. Well, so you're now involved with the campaign to pass the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, but this time from your position at the Internet Association. So bring us up to speed on where things stand with that.
Yeah, so we are in the TPA process right now. They signed the agreement. It's now in the sitting out there so people can read the agreement, understand the agreement. We're waiting on the ITC report, which is the jobs impacted by
So talk to us a little bit more about that, just so everybody in the audience understands.
So the International Trade Commission is charged within TPA with figuring out what the domestic jobs impact and the domestic impact of a trade agreement would be. And so they look at both what's in the agreement, how industry is currently functioning, and they come up with a view on, and they come up with a report about the agreement.
And the idea is that this is supposed to be a non-ideological, non-partisan, non-biased, as straight down the middle as you can get assessment of what we think, based off all of our best judgments, is going to be the impact of this agreement, right?
Correct. Yeah, and it's to just better inform the members of Congress. All of the sides of a trade agreement. So as we're talking about USMCA, I work in an industry I work in the digital industry. Obviously 25 years ago when NAFTA was done, there was no internet industry. Internet didn't exist in the original NAFTA. It was before, everyone had email addresses, or before cell phones. All of these rules governing digital trade and a lot of the services trades just didn't exist at that time. So NAFTA, so the industry I work in is one of the industries that will see the most change between the underlying NAFTA and where we are would be with this agreement.
Follow up on that a little bit. What are as we're watching this, so we're all going to be kind of following the news, are there particular issues within the agreement that are getting the most attention that we should keep an eye out on? And
yeah, so I think what you're seeing is, again, members are not coming out either for or against the agreement yet. I think a lot of them are waiting to see where ITC report, which was delayed because of the government shutdown. So we were supposed to have been getting it in about another 2 weeks, and I think it's going to be in about another month.
Another month, okay.
And so, so that's been pushed back 30 days. So I think a lot of members are in the process of figuring out what's actually in the agreement. The other thing that's happened is a lot of members have never voted on a trade agreement. When you look at the makeup of Congress now compared to where Congress was even in 2015 when we were doing TPA, it's very different. We're, I think, at 22 of the 28 TPA members who voted for it in the House are still in Congress, so we've already lost a chunk. When you look at the number of Republicans, there's a number that have obviously lost in this last election. And so a lot of these, and trade was not an issue, unlike in 2016 where both of the presidential sides were talking trade. It did not come up in this election in the same kind of way. And so a lot of members didn't have to take a stand on it. So a lot of them are figuring out what their policy is right now. In looking at the math for what USMCA is going to need on the Democratic side, you are looking at somewhere between 50 and 70 Democratic votes to be able to bring the agreement across the finish line. Some of those, or a majority of those, would assume would come from the new Democratic coalition, which are more trade-focused, moderate, pro-business Democrats. Those members, they have about 100 members within that caucus, so it's incredibly doable. Speaker Pelosi made comments a couple weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, that there's clearly a path forward, but they're still in the process of figuring out what needs to go within it and how it needs to work. I think you're seeing some issues starting to get flagged. I mean, anytime you open the paper at this point, you're seeing...
So what are the big issues that we should kind of pay attention to? That we'll probably hear about more.
Yeah, so there are questions around enforcement. There are questions around some of the labor standards and how Mexico is actually going to push those forward. You're seeing some questions on the Republican side on ISDS and dispute settlements.
That's investor-state settlement dispute, right?
Yeah. And so you're seeing some questions on sort of both sides as they're figuring out what's actually in the agreement, how it actually works. And so we're in that stage right now. But there's clearly a path forward. But as we're then starting to get into an election year, we have some of the same issues that we were having in 2016, 2015.
And we're only a couple months into this new Democratic-controlled Congress, and to your point that most of them have not, or many of them rather, have not voted on trade agreements, and it may not have been a big issue in their campaign. But do you have any sense of a pulse on how this Congress is thinking about trade? What's your take?
Yeah, so I'll get to that. One other point that I think is interesting is, unlike TPP or other trade agreements, this one, USMCA or NAFTA 2.0, because both Canada and Mexico call it different things from the United States, from what we call it. So they each have their own names. The modernized NAFTA, it's replacing a previous agreement that's currently in place. So that puts it in a very different category than a new trade agreement or opening up a new marketplace. We're replacing one that's already functioning and that's been functioning for 25 years at this point. So that also changes the calculation in a way that it's not members voting to open up a market in a new area that you would have if someone had, we'd never had the relationship with them before. So that makes this a little bit unique. As for what we're hearing on the Hill, I think what we've heard out of the committees. And today there was a hearing where Ambassador Lighthizer, who's current USTR, was up on in the Ways and Means Committee talking about China policy. So I would say at this point, within trade, there's kind of two big buckets, or three big buckets. There's the tariffs as a whole. There's the China tariffs and China policy is sort of the second bucket. And then you have USMCA. And I think those are going to be the three big sort of areas that Congress and the administration are going to be working on within the trade sphere. There's obviously the new agreements that are being looked at, where I mentioned Japan. We started negotiations with Japan. We started negotiations with the EU. And then we've started the process to, once Brexit happens, to start negotiations with the UK.
There's obviously, as we head into this presidential cycle, there's a domestic politics component to this. Do you have a sense of how Democrats are going to feel about supporting this and essentially giving President Trump a big win?
I think
that he's going to be able to then go out there and tout on the campaign trail.
Yeah, I think the reality is, you know, and what we're advising members is to look at the agreement itself. I think if the administration and the president focuses on the content of the agreement and not making it about himself, then Democrats can feel more comfortable with voting for it. I think if it becomes and the more he talks about it being his win, then it becomes more challenging to vote. I think it is, you know, comments he makes about this agreement somehow pays for the wall is incredibly not helpful with moving it. I think, you know, when he talks about, you know, it's a win for him, it's not helpful for the Democrats. When he talks about withdraw from the underlying bill, the underlying NAFTA, and then he's going to just pull out, that's incredibly not helpful on either side of the aisle. And you had leadership on both sides making that very clear that it would be troubling.
Because the idea is that people don't want to negotiate. It's sort of a hostage taking.
It's 100%
right,
a hostage situation.
Yeah.
And so you have leadership on the Republican side in the Senate and the House. You had leadership on the Democratic side in both the Senate and the House making pretty strong statements that withdraw is not a viable approach.
And so before we get to questions, what's your prediction on the USMCA? Do you think it'll be ratified?
I think there is a clear path forward for it to be ratified. I think, again, for the industry that I work within, there's a lot of positives with it. It takes what we worked on and what was added within TPP and modernizes it even further, but uses that as a base. And I think the United States, it takes us one step closer to having the tools for a modern North American economy.
All right. Well, any questions for Jordan?
How do we, yeah.
Haley's got the mic.
Oh, excellent.
I have a curiosity about, you know, the fact that after the Vietnam War, relatively soon compared, say, to Cuba, we're doing business there, and yet we have this enormous opportunity, particularly for an agricultural state like us, that could have benefited by progress in the, you know, selling of our goods to Cuba. But I understand some of the political reality, but maybe you could open up why that hasn't happened sooner.
Yeah, so I think
I'd like to know something about the intricacies of that, because it doesn't make complete sense to me at all.
I think that is a policy choice. When at the end of the Obama administration, President Obama made normalizing relations with Cuba part of what he was focused on at the end. He obviously traveled there. Secretary Pritzker was there. And I think understanding sort of some of the outdated nature of it. That said, this administration has made some policy choices where they think prolonging our distance with Cuba is actually a better choice. So that's a political decision. I think, you know, and elections have ramifications, and that was part of what came out of it. I do think long-term having a normalized relation with Cuba will happen. It's just a matter of when. Does that get at sort of what you're... Yeah, the health reasons. Yeah.
But nevertheless, I mean, the amount of years and the difference of time compared to how some were into Hanoi and doing business with Vietnam was, I mean, it's pretty incredible when you consider that by comparison.
Yeah, and I think, Vietnam shows a prime example of, a lot of what we were trying to accomplish actually with TPP was raising the labor standards there, was making sure that they had some systems in place to be able to come a little bit further even in the understanding that a strong economy actually helps normalize some of the other issues when you're able to talk. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing some of that with Cuba in the near future. But again, this administration has taken a stand on it at this point.
The electoral aspects in Florida.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is we should be. The reality is we were on our path to make sense with Cuba after how many years? Half a century?
60 years, yeah.
But the administration that we have looks at the votes in Florida, and that's it. So you got a lot. I mean, you got a lot of difficulties in front of you when you have an administration that shoots from the hip. But there you go.
Let's do Edward and then Grant. You had a question?
And I don't disagree with you.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your current position at the Internet Association. I was wondering kind of what projects do you work on? What are the big factors kind of going on related to trade and internet commerce? And what kind of a day in your life kind of looks like?
Yeah. And so thank you for that question. I think a lot of what I'm working on right now, again, USMCA and educating around that is a key part of where our focus is within digital trade. There's a lot of basic education around what digital trade is. People think of shipping containers. They don't necessarily think of data going back and forth. And as the United States economy becomes more of a service-based economy, digital and the rules around how you deal with data, how data can flow, how data is housed, all of that, makes sense for it to. So there needs to be some education on that. A lot of what we do and a lot of what I do is figuring out what are the policies that make sense for the industry as a whole. So there's a lot of working with our individual member companies as well as, again, advocating for what's coming down, tracking what's going on around the world. There's a lot of basic reading on what other countries are doing, because we're now at the forefront of digital trade. A lot of countries are figuring out how they want to handle it. So you have the EU, who, again, pushed GDPR, who's pushing a number of other policies. You have Asia and Asian countries that are pushing policies, and many of them have unintended consequences. And so we are, again, tracking what's going on, figuring out how it can actually work, and then that's sort of where we are. So it's a lot of working with the individual companies as well as working with external groups and to figure out what are the best policies and how we need to advocate for them.
These are a lot of times what we would call them the law issues of first impression, right? I mean, where this is a new area that's new, digital's new, there's not a lot of existing law and regulation around it, so it's like you're sort of helping create.
Yeah, I mean, there are rules
cases,
around it, but I think it is, within trade, it is the first.
Yeah.
So, the United States have a system of rules both within, our copyright system, our IP system, that allowed for the United States to be the leader in digital. Mm-hmm. We have that because we have the rules that allowed that, where other countries didn't have the same sort of internet boom that the United States had. And so a lot of that is because of the laws and some of the structure that we have in place. But we are at the point where we're now trying to advocate for it within trade agreements. The Obama administration, pushed it within TPP. The Trump administration has now taken it on and pushed it in USMCA. And I think it's because there's an understanding that the United States economy is shifting, and that having clear rules and advocating for the United States' clear rules is a key part of it.
You spend a lot of time on harmonization of rules, trying to make what the EU is doing, what the US is doing, what other countries are doing is
as much as possible.
Yeah.
And then tracking, obviously, I have coworkers that are dealing with individual policy areas within the United States, and so paying attention to what's going on here to be able to, policy-wise, to be able to match that to what's going on around the world.
Grant?
Yeah, I'll lead off and just say thank you for braving the weather and coming in. We really do appreciate it. I'm sure I speak for a lot of people in here when I say that. But the question I had, and it's kind of based off the idea, from the outside looking in, it oftentimes seems like government's kind of this big bureaucratic organization, the wheel continues to turn. And so we don't really get to see the man behind the curtain and the amount of agency that they get to portray. So that's kind of where my question comes into play. In your last position under the Obama administration, how much agency were you allowed to demonstrate, and could you provide an example of that so we can kind of better understand it?
Yeah, so the federal government has a lot of, you hear about the workforce, but the people that we worked with at the Department of Commerce, the career staff are pretty amazing, and they are dedicated to advocating for the United States' interests, for the economic interests, and are well-versed in what's going on. And so you have, the Department of Commerce is, 12 bureaus? And so, we were both in ITA, but there are a number of other bureaus that also sort of touched what was going on. You had BEA looking at stats, and you had BIS working on export controls and others. And so there are a number of different people who are very focused on specific policy areas, specific programs, and part of what was going on at the White House with the interagency process was getting all of those to row in the same direction and advocating in the same way. But you have hardworking people who are still there, who are there no matter what, and are nonpartisan and making a real difference. I don't know if that gets at some of what you were going for. Or,
some of it. I was curious to the extent that you're able to kind of solve problems as an individual within kind of a large organization. Because it seems as if, the president will set kind of a vision, and then it's left everyone underneath to decide how that's thought out. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I would say that there are a lot of meetings when you're in the executive branch. There are a lot of coordination. Getting a letter out the door takes a number of signatures. Getting any fact sheet done takes a lot of making sure that it impacts policies across the board, and that you're not, going out too hard on something that impacts something else. So there's a lot of coordination that happens, and that there are people who are dedicated to making sure that it actually makes sense and that it's not just a free-for-all. I think, the downside of shooting from the hip is often we have conflicting policies at play right now. And so I think that, there are people there who want to make the system work and make sure that we are moving in the right direction and moving in the government's direction.
You touched very briefly on this, but you said that the opposition to trade legislation often comes in two parts, labor and the environment. I don't think we've discussed what an environmental pushback would look like. Is it mostly with transportation? What are Congress people saying is their concern? Yeah,
so, and again, I don't want to speak for a specific view, but what we often see is NAFTA did not have environment within the base agreement. USMCA does, TPP did, but they want higher standards around environmental issues, and so wanting it to be, wanting the United States' policy and sort of forward-leaning on environmental issues to be codified within other countries. So it's if that's EPA standards or water standards or whatever the issues are. And again, I'm talking hypothetically within it, that they want those standards to be high standards, and they want to bring other countries up to our standard. Often what you hear is, workforce issues go elsewhere because they don't have the EPA requirements, and they don't have the clean water and the labor standards and all of that. So what we want, and what a lot of people want, is it to raise it even higher within a trade agreement for another country.
What's your definition of digital trade? What are we talking about in 5 or 6 examples?
Yeah, so it's marketing data, it's payroll data, it's how you house data.
Not just the software, but
It's software, it's licensing around software, it's licensing, interconnections between countries and how even the data flows between countries. While we were at Department of Commerce, I worked on Privacy Shield, which allows data flows within an individual company to flow between the United States and the EU. So it is even that, within your same company, the ability to transfer marketing data, the ability to transfer payroll data, the ability to figure out what the products actually look like, all of that would be just passing across, if we would, we were sitting in the same office passing across because the office is in another country. There are rules around that and how you can pass data and pass all of that. And so we set out standards and allowed for the Privacy Shield framework to function to allow it to still go forward.
so the cybersecurity issue is part of it.
Cybersecurity, machine reading, all of the above. The digital trade chapter within USMCA, covers everything from source code and AI to how data is housed and data localization, banning of data localization, banning of taxing on digital products. So, pulling down a stream, every time you pull down a stream, you don't want to have a tax on that. That is A, very hard to manage, and B, sets out a whole different system. And then it, everything beyond that. It's a pretty robust chapter within the agreement.
Your international trade is probably
I think yeah, go for it.
least understood by the general citizenship of the country. Well, the international trade is misunderstood, not understood by the population as a whole. So what you run into is then the politicians, for fear of election results, will go one way or another, even if they think you're right. TPP was a good example of how that happened. If you had your wish book out, how would you educate the population so that they're not so afraid of what it means?
I think the key thing, and we talked about this a lot during the TPP fight, and TPA, was explaining how many different jobs were actually connected to trade. A lot of people don't think that their job is a trade-supported job, and the reality is their job is 100% supported by trade, but because they're not the one taking the container off the ship, they don't think about it being trade, but it's, the secretary's working in a law firm that deals with international issues. It's the international lawyers. It's the the worker who is selling products that are manufactured somewhere else. It is, where then they're able to have their salary because the product's coming in the way it is. So there are trade-supported jobs that people just don't understand. So if I can, wave the wand, it's, I think, people understanding how many of their jobs and how many of their friends' jobs and how many of their family members' jobs are supported by international trade and by clear rules around international trade. Because I think that's the other side of it, is making sure that clear rules exist so that both companies and workers understand what's required of them when they're dealing internationally. And I think we're seeing that more and more. Those of you that are in school right now, it's second nature for you to have friends who could be on another continent, or for you to send emails across state lines, or for you to travel, where even 15, 20 years ago, that just didn't happen, where you weren't connected in the same way. So as the world becomes more global, having clear rules around how that functions and how that works makes a lot of sense.
So I have a question concerning the vote counting of getting trade stuff done. So what are kind of like the safe areas for like yeses, the safe areas for no's, and where are kind of the battlegrounds for like geographically?
Yeah, so when you look at the map, I think it depends on the trade agreement. There are a lot of studies looking at, for each state, what their top foreign trading partner is. So what may be the top trade areas for an EU trade agreement may be different than the U.S.-Mexico Canada agreement, or that was different than when we were doing vote counting on TPP. That said, to use the example of USMCA, when you're looking at pro areas, you're looking at along the Mexican border, you're looking at West Coast, you're looking at coming some of the middle of the country into this area, and you're looking at sort of the South are sort of the key pro-trade areas and where votes tend to come. For legacy reasons, the Great Lakes region tends to be more challenging for trade. And then sort of as you spread out from there, it tends to be and it can often be a district by district. So, an area that has a large port or has a large influx of jobs dependent on trade becomes a sort of a standout, even within a region that could be very anti-trade. And the same can be true inverse. And you see that, especially with the big port cities where jobs are 100% supported. Does that answer that? Yeah.
Any other questions before we wrap up here? All right. You want to close this out with any final thoughts or anything we didn't touch on?
No, I just want to thank you for having me, and thank you guys for coming out and listening to me talk. Having more people, as your point, educated about how trade actually impacts them is important. I'm sorry? I'm based in Washington, D.C.
Well, even right here in Kansas, the lack of understanding of how much export dollars, per capita basis, we have greater exports per capita than all of our surrounding adjacent states.
Yeah, and when ag issues are big, Kansas's representatives tend to be at the forefront of the ag debates.
But it's much more than ag in Kansas. That's the point. There are companies throughout the state that are unknown, even in their own towns and cities, that are reliant 20%, 30%, 40%, 50% on exports. And that story doesn't get out. I don't know, because of the newspapers, it doesn't have sex appeal to put it in the paper. But it's an important story. And your fight is made more difficult because the politicians are knee-jerk reactions. If people are ignorant of really what's going on, politicians will react because there are elections coming up. And then you have to face the fights that you have to face with it. And again, it's too bad. But I do think universities and newspapers can maybe go further to get the word out, to do more of what we're doing here, but get the word out to the population. Get the statistics out, because they do prove that the jobs...
It's not just exports, but imports also. That
right,
imports support a job. No, but both of those support many industries that you don't think of as being trade-supported jobs, and that was, as I mentioned, a key factor.
We have companies right here in Kansas that are not ag companies, that 30, 40, 50% of their business is exports. Those are jobs right here.
Yeah.
But you never hear about those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. We'd hope to see you here next week for what I think will be another really interesting discussion group. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.